thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I thought a lot about what I wanted to talk about with you and decided not to talk about one particular paper or one particular study, but to instead talk about a whole field. Just talk about everything that I know about. So that's what I'm going to do. And to start, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the EASEL Lab and what we do. And then I'm going to talk about social emotional learning as a field. And I do that by covering what I think are the three big areas that are important, which is like, what do we know about from the science about social and emotional learning? What do we actually know about effective practice? And then what are some innovations that I think are important to tackle or take on to drive more effective practice in the field? And these are really about building new approaches to practice and then what I call kind of dealing with the lexicon. And I'll get to that in a moment. So you'll see that I have a PowerPoint disorder. I make too many. I sit on the airplane and it like gets out of control. And so I love to mess with the animations. It's really actually a significant problem. So I'm going to, I don't see a clock in here, but I'll stop. Is there a clock on here? I'll stop at some point. I don't know what time it will be. But then if someone has it, someone can tell me when it is roughly 5 o'clock. Wait, no, 4:30? All right, that's great. I'll stop and you can ask me questions and hopefully I will have gotten through it all. But if not, feel free to ask me questions about the things that you didn't even hear about. Okay, so the backdrop is really the work of the EASEL Lab. And I am I deemed myself the director of that lab. And our work in the lab is all focused on social and emotional learning. I also do work in early childhood, and I co-direct the Saul Zantz Early Education Initiative with Noni Lasso at the Ed School. And so I'm also happy to talk about that if anyone's interested in that at the end. The EASEL Lab, which stands for Ecological Approaches to Social and Emotional Learning, we do three major things. We do kind of straight up research and evaluation. So we do big longitudinal studies of children and families, linking experiences to their developmental trajectories over time. And we do evaluations of strategies, practices, programs focused on social, emotional, and behavioral kinds of things, typically in early childhood settings and elementary school settings. We do, in the middle, we design interventions. This is not something when I was in graduate school that I thought I would ever do, which is sort of make something to be done in a classroom or a school. And as we spent more and more time evaluating existing programs and learning about the features of them that were maybe effective and the features of them that weren't, and the kinds of things that were really missing that were also evident in the literature as important, we began to think, like, why wouldn't we get into this and start designing interventions, strategies, and practices, and then implementing them and testing them. So we do a fair amount of that. And then finally, we were doing work that we probably super arrogantly, so I apologize, described as like building the field. So the field of social emotional learning has been around for a long time. It's not a new thing by any means, but it's really gotten a lot of interest in the last 5 years. And there's a lot of interest and a lot of talk and a lot of stuff out there. And it can be really quite confusing to figure out what's really solid research, what is practice or strategies or things that we might feel confident about, and what is the right terminology to characterize what we're doing. So I'm going to show you a little bit of that too. So all of the work of the EASEL Lab, I'm a developmental psychologist by training, but I really think of myself in a funny way as like a prevention scientist. And prevention science as a discipline arose probably in the 70s, 80s, focused really on strategies, practices, programs designed to mitigate major disorder and human dysfunctions. It's focused on clinical disorder. And the approach of prevention science is really to think deeply about what we know and link it very tightly to what we then do, and then do studies of what we do to cycle back in and build the knowledge base further. Prevention science as a discipline has been sort of more broadly applied recently, and we see it as in education and highly applicable to education. And so I think of myself as a prevention scientist, and that's really about fundamentally always in pretty much every endeavor in the lab, linking what we know to what we do, and then using what we do to build the knowledge base further. And so it's about this cycle. It's about using research to make decisions about what we should focus on and how, and then designing strategies and practices or adopting them, which is what we do. Asking the question, did it make the difference we expected? And doing assessment and evaluation, and then having that, of course, feed back in to the knowledge base. And so that's basically how I constructed this talk, which is to give you a sense of what we know and how that relates to what we do, and then to talk a little bit about innovation. So first, the science. For those of you who don't know what social emotional learning is, who's never heard of social emotional learning? It's never that, that someone asks the question where nobody raises a hand, but I just did. So everybody has heard of social emotional learning. For those of you who don't really have a sense of what it really fundamentally is, just spend 2 seconds and cast your head inside this moment, which is, in this case, an early childhood educator with a bunch of kids reading a book, engaging in an academic task. And all of those kids are in there, and just think about what does it take for those kids in that setting to access the kinds of stuff that's being communicated by that teacher about that book, the words, the academic vocabulary, the narrative structure of the book. What do they have to do to get that, right? Just imagine that for a moment. Put yourself in the head of that kid. And what you might be thinking is that those kids have to focus their thinking, they have to sustain it, they have to shift it from one thing to the others. They have to really manage and modulate their attention. They have to manage their behavior, right? Because everybody is actually bumping into each other all the time, and that's very activating for a young child. And so they have to manage their tendency to bump right back. So they have to hang on to their bodies and manage their behavior. They have to be able to have and hold positive relationships with their peers and with that adult. They have to trust what she is communicating with them, so they believe the words that she is saying and aren't distracted by anxiety about the relationship or a question about it. And then throughout, of course, they have to understand and deal with feelings, the kinds of things that arise in any kind of learning task: frustration, excitement, exuberance, melancholy, all of those things. So you could imagine this learning task in any setting, right, at any age. This is my 12-year-old facing probability for the first time a few weeks ago and losing his mind about it in the classroom and at home. This is my daughter in her literature of the mind class. Like, this is happening in every learning task. All of these things are at play. So if you walk away with anything from today, it is anytime someone says, I don't see where social and emotional learning fits into the academic world, you can say, wait a minute, cast your mind into the head of. So that's the basic idea. The challenge is that how those things, those 4 things, get described in research and then in a lot of the translational stuff that comes out of research is in all of these different ways: emotional intelligence, social intelligence, character traits, focus, social emotional learning, 21st century skills, grit. All those things are out there swirling about, and it's really hard to figure out exactly what are the concrete and specific skills, what are the major domains that characterize this field. So, and that, you know, if we really are true to the cycle, linking research to practice, to evaluation, back up to what we know, we need to be precise and consistent in our terminology, and it has to draw from the research literature. So in our lab, as many of you do, we think about these kinds of things a lot, and we have done, through a variety of projects, a whole set of kind of distillations of the literature in order to try and define the boundaries of the big domain of social and emotional learning, and to be quite specific and precise about the subdomains that sit inside each of those. And this is basically what we have come up with. There are skills and competencies, things you know and can do, in 3 major domains. If you look at the word, if you go out and Google social emotional learning, you're probably not going to come up with cognitive, emotion, and social. You'll definitely get these 2, but there is a very fundamental, foundational, even cognitive domain. And these include specific skills in the cognitive domain, things like managing and shifting attention. I just talked about that. Controlling impulses, planning and goal setting, critical thinking. In the emotion domain, specific and concrete things like emotion knowledge and expression, emotion and behavioral regulation, empathy. In the social domain, understanding social cues, so being able to read and understand the social environment without words. Social perspective taking, jumping into the head of another, pro-social behavior, effective conflict resolution, social problem solving. That actually is not all. There's a whole bunch more. And this, a colleague of mine termed the belief ecology. It's kind of like if you imagine the kinds of things, the beliefs and the values and the core ideas that then guide whether or not you use the skills and competencies when you need to. And these are often not included in the conversation about social and emotional learning. At least some of them are not included, but they are everywhere. So the belief ecology really represents attitudes or habits of mind, ways of thinking, values, and we organize them into 3 general categories. Beliefs and knowledge of self and identity, so things like self-efficacy, growth mindset. This is like the hotbed of mindset. Everybody here knows all about that. Agency, self-esteem, self-knowledge. Sometimes you hear things like purpose, character and values, ethical performance, intellectual, civic values. And then personality, things like optimism, gratitude, openness, things like zest. So Character Lab talks a lot about zest. I think that's a personality characteristic. I'm not entirely sure. It's kind of a great word, but what's interesting is that there are people who do research sort of across these domains. There are people who do robust and really captivating research even just within one. And then there are those who write about the field generally and make it the case for it, who call things like personality characteristics, social emotional skills and competencies, like Jim Heckman, who writes about soft skills and non-cognitive skills, and social emotional skills, but he doesn't write about these things. He writes about and uses in his studies these things. So this is how we describe the kind of broad boundaries of the field of social and emotional learning. And this will come up over and over again because we use this kind of rubric for coding and trying to understand what's inside programs and what's inside frameworks, and those will both come up a little bit later. As some of you might know, there was a national commission on social, emotional, and academic learning that did its work for a couple of years and finished and released a really great report in January of 2019. And that commission had a bunch of groups on it. It had a group of scientists, it had a group of practitioners, it had a group of parents, it had a group of policymakers, and each of those groups wrote a report about like the next generation of work in that particular area relevant to this topic. And one of the big questions throughout was like, what's the framework going to be? Like, how are we going to define this field? And what they ended up with, which was sort of bought into by the hundreds of people who participated in that commission, which is pretty important because they were from a vast array of disciplines and sectors, they came up with something not unlike what I just showed you. Yay! They have in the middle, so they have rigorous academic content and learning experiences. They have these 3 core domains, cognitive, emotion, and social skills and competencies. And then they have this ring on the outside, which has sort of character and values on this side, and attitudes, beliefs, and mindsets on the other. And then everything is situated in relationships and interactions. I think that this perspective, this kind of framework, will be soon one that dominates the way people talk about this as it gets into people's minds and gets out there more, because it is quite comprehensive and it's also at the same time quite specific. Okay, so I'm a developmental psychologist. I always think about things developmentally, and what I always want to know is like, okay, that's 5,000 different things that you've just told me about that are all important. They can't possibly all be important all the time. And so if I'm going to connect this research describing this body of skills to what we might do, what am I going to focus on and when? And there isn't really a good distillation developmental story about this whole body of things. But because we do work trying to design interventions and strategies for early childhood, for elementary, a little bit in middle school, we try and think about it developmentally. And so we came up with a kind of heuristic to guide how we might focus and be precise in our intervention efforts. And so what we've sort of gleaned from the literature, and our work is primarily in these three areas, not the belief ecology. There are others who are doing that work, and my hunch is that there is also a version of a developmental progression, but that most of the literature about the belief ecology comes from secondary, comes from populations in middle school and high school, which doesn't mean it's not important or evident in early childhood. I just don't think we have as robust a body of information about it. So in this first stage, like think about the entry into school or some kind of educational or care setting like 3 to 6. We know that these core skills emerge first and they really expand significantly, especially these core executive functions, but like basic emotion skills in management and sort of emotion knowledge and expression, and then basic social engagement. So if we were to really think about what's important to focus on in early childhood, it wouldn't be sophisticated problem solving. It would actually be these things which set the stage for some of those more complex skills later on. A second group of skills, imagine sort of the middle of elementary school. We have a set of more complex cognitive skills like planning and organizing and setting goals. A more complex set of emotion skills, empathy and perspective taking, which bleed across the emotion and the social areas. And then really understanding, reading, and using information about social cues. Very hard to do this if you've never had any experience in the social environment. You have no information to populate your automatic interpretations of what you're reading in the faces or in the tone of voice of others. It's really hard to jump into the head of another person if you don't have some level of cognitive flexibility, if you can't shift your thinking in one way or the other. And then finally, heading toward the transition to middle school, this more sophisticated social problem solving. So that's kind of the developmental picture that guides our intervention design work. I'll tell you that when you look really closely at social and emotional learning programs designed for kindergarten all the way through 5th grade, there is very little evident in them that suggests anything developmental, even though, those kids are developing and they have, certain tasks that they're working on at different developmental stages. But programming really doesn't operate this way yet. Okay, so what's the evidence? What do we know about this body of skills? We have vast amounts of literature and science from all kinds of disciplines that tell us about the sort of phenomenology of individual things. There's also a lot of work that gives us a sense of the role of these kinds of skills in the future, so in life outcomes, that gives us a sense of whether or not if we design something and implement it that is a direct manipulation that's designed to build those skills, whether we see those outcomes. And then we have other kinds of things that come along too. So I'll tell you a little bit about these. We have a handful of long-term correlational studies. Here's a PowerPoint disorder moment. Like it took me almost a whole day to make this and then animate it. And then I took all the animations out, but to be a little faster. And that was even a couple years ago, and I still use it because I put so much time into it. So these correlational studies give us a sense of the sort of predictive power of some of these skills measured in early childhood and linked not simply to things like scores on standardized tests or sort of academic outcomes like grades, but to the kinds of things that society as a whole is really worried about. And so there's a paper, the Dunedin study, Moffitt paper about self-control, links self-control to a variety of these life outcomes 20 to 30 years later after controlling sociodemographic characteristics and intervening kind of academic stuff. There's a paper from the Fast Track study linking social competence in kindergarten to those kinds of outcomes, and they apparently have a paper, Mark Greenberg told me, but I've never been able to find it, where they link social competence in kindergarten to voting behavior, not how you vote, but whether or not you vote, which may be tied to this low criminal offending or low engagement with the criminal justice system. And then there are economists who are writing about, this doesn't quite fit the figure, but I put it in anyway, the skills demanded of the future labor market. So David Deming, who's an economist at Harvard, has written about sort of the demand for people skills, which he, in his paper, describes quite specifically as these kinds of things. So we know that these kinds of skills and competencies early on are really important for later life outcomes through a kind of correlational set of correlational studies. We also have like a vast number of trials of specific interventions, and we have a smaller number of multi-program studies that give us a sense of what we can expect when we do interventions or programs in this particular area. And these tell us about these emotional, behavioral, and social outcomes that result, and they give us a sense of whether or not there is impact variation for particular subgroups or entities, school characteristics or classroom characteristics. And they also give us a sense of what we can expect in terms of changes at the classroom level in what teachers do in teacher practice and pedagogy. And these studies are pretty much of this kind of thing, which is like programs that have been designed by someone and dominate the marketplace in social emotional learning. This is really what the practice looks like. There have been a number of meta-analyses, this one in particular that came out in 2011. This is sometimes people call it like the Castle meta-analysis because it was written by people who work at Castle. And there's a fair number of criticisms of some of the components of this particular study, but it really, at the moment it arrived in the world, it really propelled this field forward, in particular because they documented from these 213 studies of social emotional programs across early, elementary, middle, and high school. They documented effects in the domains you would expect given what those programs focus on, but also in academic performance. And that got everybody like, wait, oh my gosh, you can do this and focus on social and emotional skills and you get this academic bump too. Hallelujah, we'll all do this. Everybody's going to do this now. Since then, there have been a couple of other meta-analyses that largely confirm these findings, done slightly different ways. There's one more recent one that pulled out the set of studies that had follow-ups and documented that for those studies that had follow-ups post-intervention, that some of the impacts were enduring up to 3 years post-intervention. So there's a signal in all of this that tells us that there's something about work in this area that seems to be impactful. Here's an example from a study we did of the 4Rs program, reading, writing, respect, and resolution. This was back in the early 2000s. And this is pretty characteristic of these trials, randomized trials of interventions like this. You have a bunch of schools randomized to get the intervention or not. In this case, it was the 4Rs program. There's a big training and in some cases some professional coaching that goes on during the course of the year, and then someone is collecting vast amounts of data on children and teachers and in classrooms. And in this particular study of the 4Rs, we randomized schools to 4Rs or not. We saw over 2 years, so this was an intervention that was implemented actually for 3 consecutive years. After the first 2 years, we saw differences between the intervention and the control schools in students' self-report of their attributional biases, the degree to which they attribute hostility in ambiguous social problem-solving situations, their choice of aggression to solve problems, and in their depression, their depressive symptoms, all improved, better in the intervention group. In teacher reports of aggressive behavior, kids' attention problems, and social competence, all better in the intervention group. And like many of these other studies, when we looked at the effect sizes across all those things, they were, a fifth of a standard deviation, which is actually not that different from what you see from evaluations of interventions in social emotional learning in other areas in education. Like, it's pretty consistent. There were no average effects in this study for academic outcomes, but there was some important variation by baseline characteristics, which I'll show you in a second. So this is one set of interactions that followed a pattern that we saw over and over and over again, which is that for academic outcomes, the kids who were identified by teachers at baseline as struggling the most with behavior, those particular kids, the ones who were not just elevated but above the clinical threshold on a set of measures of behavior problems as reported by their teachers, those kids benefited the most from this social emotional learning intervention for their academic outcomes. That's these kids in these green bars. And there's something, I mean, there's some pattern to this. When you look across studies, you tend to find that kids who struggle the most in one area or another at the beginning of the study benefit the most. They have lots of movement to make in those outcomes. For this, I think there's a particularly important lesson to be learned from it, which is that the students who are in this, it's actually a relatively small number of students, something like 8% of the population in this study, they have a big impact on classrooms and schools. They are typically the kids who are excluded and marginalized in schools. They are moved out of classrooms. They are expelled and suspended. And in this case, our hypothesis is that for these kids in particular, the culture and climate of the school and the practices of the teachers were making a difference for them. They were in their classrooms. So we saw also, I'm not showing it here, an effect for attendance. They were in school on average 6 days more per year than the kids, their counterparts in the control group. They're in those classrooms. They are accessing the academic content more than they were otherwise when they were not in the classrooms. So there's a story here that is, in a sense, about the relationship between SEL and equity. And that's an area that has garnered a great deal of interest of late. How does SEL interface with questions of equity? And I think that this represents part of the key process behind it. Okay, at the classroom level, when you look across studies, you definitely see impacts of social emotional learning interventions of all types, like all different kinds, on classroom level outcomes. They're pretty consistent across studies, so you can count on your hand and then maybe even onto your other hand the number of studies of different interventions that have documented effects at the classroom level. I think one reason for that is they're all using the same measure. They're all using the classroom assessment scoring system. These effects are pretty robust, but they're at the classroom level, which gives us just a little bit of pause. So we definitely see evidence for the impact of these kinds of interventions on kid outcomes. But in general, if you ask the more skeptical folks, they would say, actually, the findings are really very mixed. So when you look at those big multi-program studies, like the social and character development study that was conducted in the 2000s, it was a multi-program, large-scale IES, Department of Education, sorry, not IES, funded demonstration study, 7 programs, 7 local evaluations, and 1 national evaluation. And basically, after many millions of dollars, this is not a surprise to some of you, there were no effects, no differences between the groups. And that suggests that these kinds of programs are not effective. So large multi-program studies with general measurement batteries give us one story. The meta-analyses, which is another form of lumping, as I describe it, give us another story, but they don't give us information about where we might focus our work if we wanted to, because they've piled a lot of different kinds of things together. What I'm describing is splitting, which is like individual program evaluation with close measurement, meaning measurement batteries are identified and linked very closely to the theory of action of the program itself. These kinds of studies really do show, like the 4 Rs, impacts on kids' outcomes. But it's hard to aggregate across them because every single study uses a different set of measures. And so it's hard to track findings across the studies specifically. So across all of them, implementation varies tremendously. So even in a sort of semi-well-controlled field experiment, implementation is incredibly variable, and no one has ever said, well, so what are the key elements of this that make a difference? These programs have a lot in them. They're training, there's lots of components, they have lots of scope and sequence, meaning there's lots of units, they happen over time, there's lots of stuff to do. We really have no idea what, that whole mix is actually important to do. Okay, so we have meta-analyses, cost-benefit analyses. I just described this before. And then the final piece of evidence that we sort of have available to us, I think, is a new science of stress, the brain, and behavior. And this work, which is growing and I think critical to this whole field, tells us that these kinds of skills and competencies in particular, others do as well, but these in particular, develop in a complex system of context, interactions, relationships, so there's an experiential landscape, right? They happen in the context of experiences. They are particularly vulnerable to stress and adversity. And the process whereby that happens appears to be that stress and exposure to trauma directly influence those core executive functions, self-regulation, which then cascades into behavior. And social emotional learning interventions might be a key response to that kind of dynamic. Okay, that's like 25 years of science boiled into a very short period of time with a whole lot left out. Any very quick questions about that? Okay, I'm just going to keep on going. All right, the practice. So we have like the knowledge we have to draw upon, and now trying to figure out what to do. A lot of the work that I'm about to describe comes out of this report. It's called Navigating SEL from the Inside Out. It was a report we did in the lab commissioned by the Wallace Foundation. It's basically a guide to social emotional learning programs for elementary school. And we approached this project with an overt goal and a covert goal. The overt goal was to do what Wallace Foundation was paying us to do, which is like create a guide. And the covert goal was to basically code and deconstruct SEL programs to try and figure out what their common elements are. And I'll get to that in a moment. This guide is 400 pages. You'd think that no one would literally ever want to even open it up because it's really long and dense. It has been downloaded 100,000 times in 1 year. So there is a great appetite for information in the field. I have downloaded it from my office 50,000 of those times. So 50,000 times in a year. So we got to know social emotional learning programs really well in doing that project. If you look at the guide, you can get online right now and look at it. It's free. You'll see that it has really detailed profiles of each program. And in generating those profiles, basically read every single word of every part of every single program. And what we learned overall from that endeavor is that really effective practice in SEL has two major components. Surprise, surprise, teaching, right? Teaching the skills, teaching kids about these skills. And this instruction part, you find breaks into four major elements. Modeling, like living the skills that you hope kids will have. Teaching them, like teaching the vocabulary of attention. I used to say to my little son when he was little, somehow I'm still saying this, but this is the story from when he was little, pay attention. Pay attention, we have to get your shoes on, we got to get out the door. He's looking up at me like, what are you talking about? He doesn't know what the word attention is, right? Doesn't know what that word means. He doesn't know yet what to show me that will tell me that he is paying attention. He needs to be taught that. But we forget, right? Especially in this domain, that kids don't know what respect means. What does that word mean? Like we in this room would absolutely not agree about what that means. So if we think that kids who are being told, please show some respect or be respectful, it's an important idea, but we don't share information directly about what that means. Like what is that? Like what do you do when you're being respectful? So taught, practice, lots of opportunity to practice, like practice the skill, do poorly, practice again, do well. And then a language of this social emotional work in the setting. So there's this instructional part that has those 4 characteristics. And then, of course, establishing safe, caring, learning environments with effective behavior management. So one thing that's also forgotten in the field is that SEL, social emotional learning, and discipline, structures, practices, and policies go very closely together. But nobody ever talks about them together, right? But they're in the same world, and they really either bump up against each other or can blend together really effectively. But effective classroom and school management or behavior management is really part of this. So having a really wonderful, deeply connected experience, a teacher who really knows how to teach this stuff and weaves it into their instructional work, for that child that is a great experience, but it is only going to go so far if they really feel in the rest of that environment that they are not safe and they don't belong. Right? So these 2 parts go closely together. So just a few examples of, we were talking about this at lunch, what are the kinds of things that you actually see in the practice? Like, what does it look like for an adult to model something in a classroom? What are the devices that teachers use or that social emotional learning programs use? Things like scaffolds for making I statements, like a strip that is in the classroom that everybody uses to remind them that when you're having problems with somebody, it's really helpful to tell them how you feel. And here's a way to do it. You can do it this way every time, even the adults. So having something like this in the classroom is a direct support for adults to begin to engage in and practice the same kinds of things that we hope kids will do. Thinking aloud, so narrating your own experience, is something that teachers are supported to do in a lot of programs. That is another form of modeling. Gosh, when I'm really frustrated, you know what I want to do? I also want to stamp my foot. And I sometimes feel like crying too. What do I do when I feel that way? Well, sometimes I just close my eyes for a minute. So that kind of outside narration of an adult's inner experience is both captivating to kids, but is also something that they can learn from. Teaching in SEL, a lot of the teaching about these particular skills comes from high-quality children's literature, and there's all kinds of lessons and activities that are embedded in them. There's just mountains of this stuff. And then practice and discuss happens through routines and games, like the structures that sort of make the work of classrooms happen, like the routines that are the things that happen every day in the classroom. Those are opportunities to be taken advantage of to do SEL work, prepared role plays, paired learning, real-world learning experiences, sort of teachable moments as they happen. So this is drawn, I think, from Castle, but we remade it. Features of effective practice across all of those programs. It's all the things that I just described. The things that are taught, modeled, practice, discuss, that's ours, happen in the context of belonging and safety, are focused on building adult skills or covertly doing it along the way. Consider the broader context for the work, so the school inside a community, connected to families, are very specific and targeted to behaviors and skills, so it is clear what the activity is really targeted to, what specific skill, and don't expect to achieve everything immediately. So what have we heard? So what do we think it takes to really do this work actually for real effectively, and to do it in a way that gets beyond a single program or a single test of a program? And what do we hear actually when we are out in the field talking to educators about what they want? We hear these things. A desire for stuff that can be integrated into the instructional work of the classroom. So teachers don't actually want someone to give them a program that they have to do on the side or find the time to do. They want ideas about how to weave this work into their instructional work. When I am teaching math, what am I doing to support attention, perspective taking, and empathy? So integration into the structures of schooling. They want focus and supports for adults. Teachers know that they struggle in these areas. There is no teacher pre-service professional training in social and emotional learning, even though it is foundational to success in the classroom. And then They want some mechanism or tool or way to maintain the quality of the work and sustain it in their setting over time. So in response to that, we've been thinking about how to rethink how the practical work happens in SEL in order to meet those needs. Integration, a focus on adults, and sustained and high quality practice at scale. And this is something we call SEL Kernels. I'll just give you a flavor of it. So I already told you this. What does SEL work actually typically look like out in the marketplace? It looks just like these things. This is, you can buy these programs or download them. Some cases they're free. They are a program. They are multi-component. They have a scope and sequence. They are curricular, largely. They're complex, and they are designed to be done a particular way, right? They are inflexible. Many of them have been studied, and they're deemed to be effective, but those studies have really taken that kind of average treatment effect approach, like this group did it, kind of, and then this group really didn't, and we saw these average effects. It doesn't tell us really about what has to be done to make it effective. What are the key mechanisms or active ingredients? There's little theory about that either. Out in the world, after the study is done, there's actually not a lot of buy-in for these kinds of things. We are hearing over and over again, and in our group and from others, that the kind of program model isn't what people want in schools. So taking what we've learned about social emotional learning interventions and then trying to scale it using that particular mechanism, the program as a mechanism, isn't going to work, because people don't actually want to do that. That's not actually what they want to do. There's a big disconnect between the what we know and then the what we do part. So we think there's an opportunity to improve SEL interventions, and we think about this along these two dimensions. One is resources, right here. So down here, low resources, doesn't take a lot of time, it's not costly, and it doesn't demand much of our setting. At the top would be high resources, so the opposite of that. And here we have flexibility over here, lots of flexibility. You can choose something, you can adapt it, you can implement it in a way that makes sense given your setting, and that's really flexible. And on the other end, you have to do it as it was designed. And so I would put all of the stuff we have available to us in social and emotional learning on the practice side up in that high resource, low flexibility category. And I put this here when I was giving a talk like this in order to appease some of the kind of SEL mafia out there who are like, wait a minute. These are evidence-based practices. You can't mess with them, because you can't expect them to work unless they were done just as they were done in the study, the 1 or 2 studies that have been done on them. Paths, more studies, maybe 3 or 4. So, yeah, totally. But what if no one's ever going to do that? Are we going to invest all this time and energy and resources in something that we can not expect to achieve those outcomes because it won't be done as it is done in those studies? So our notion is like, let's build on this great work and think of something that is maybe more doable. So our question has been like, what are the practices that are common to these programs? Like, we can't mount, someone can. I invite all of you to please just take this on and do it. We can't do this, which is like the multifactorial design that would allow you to compare all those components of SEL programs to each other. That's very expensive, it's very time consuming, and I'm not sure it gives you quite the right answer, but I bet someone in this room could take that on and do it. I don't want to do it. So with that, like, how do you figure out what's the mechanism? Like, what's the active ingredient of these programs? My hypothesis is perhaps it's the thing that's the same across them. So if there are 20 things that all of these programs do, specific strategies and practices, maybe those are the things that account for their common effects on outcomes. So what if we just identified those and turned them into standalone strategies and gave them to people to try, tested them in the field? So if you did that, you could design things that are very targeted to specific skills. that are very doable, that are strategy-based, meaning they don't demand a whole curriculum and a scope and sequence just to get to that one strategy. So they're designed to be doable, to be integratable because they're small, efficient, and maybe scalable, right? Because it's much easier to spread around a bunch of strategies than a set of programs that people might take into their classroom but will just leave on the shelf, actually. So designed to be doable, integratable, efficient, and scalable, and then have this kind of this idea of like a rigid structure that is adaptable. So it's not, some of you might be thinking, wait, you can't just willy-nilly do this kind of stuff. You can't just make stuff up. That's not being true to the evidence. Perhaps like if you look at those common elements and you identified them, maybe they all do things in the same way. Maybe they all have sort of a structure to them that is the same, and then if you do those things, maybe you could adapt around it, and that makes it very flexible. And then finally, if we think that if we can do these things, we're going to have a set of things that we can test, and in the marketplace they might be more done, right? They will be taken up and they will actually be done more. And then you might achieve effect sizes on outcomes that are the same as any one of those programs or more because it's just simply done more. So we got down this road with just a component of one big complicated intervention. So I'm not being super kind about the programs. I admit it, and I apologize. But I'll also admit that when we started down this road, we designed a program. The first thing we did was like, oh, none of these other programs are good enough. We'll make another, and it'll be better. And we learned in our trial of that program, which is called Secure, that teachers gravitated toward the routines and the structures and didn't do the lessons. This didn't surprise anybody we told about this. They were like, yeah, people don't really want to do the lessons. They don't have time for it. So that they want is the stuff that they can like do quickly. And the one thing that they did was this one routine we created called brain games. They did it all the time. And brain games were designed by us, but building on a lot of work of other people, to design games focused on executive function, self-regulation. And we learned from the teachers that they wanted to do these games because they are games. Number one, there are no games in school. They're games. They were targeted to a set of skills that they were linking in their heads to the brain, so important. And they could really do them at any time. They were doing them at recess. They were doing them in the transitions during the day. They were doing them all the time, and they fit their practice. So with the brain games, we did this trial. We learned the things I just described to you from the teachers. We also learned in our trial that the outcomes that we observed for kids were completely consistent with this profile of implementation. So we saw in the kids in the group assigned to the Secure Intervention, who just did, or not just, but they mostly did the brain games, increases in their focused attention, reduced impulsivity, and then we saw gains in their standardized tests of literacy. This is in Arizona. I can't remember what those tests are called. So we thought, wow, okay, there's a couple of things that are important to learn here. One is teachers are gravitating toward this type of thing. And when they do that thing, you see changes in the outcomes that are tied to that thing. Like if you target and you really do a lot of it, you might see effects in that specific outcome. But you have to measure it, so you have to be knowledgeable enough to measure that specific thing. So then we took this like very rudimentary thing that like literally printed in my office, like on a piece of paper, a game on a piece of paper, and we thought, wow, we're going to pull this out and redesign them and test them as their own thing. So we redesigned them, we piloted them with teachers, our redesign. We were working with like a design firm that said, make it look like a cell phone. Put all the cards on a ring and make it fit in your hand like a cell phone. So we said, okay, we'll do that. And we did that, and the teachers were like, yeah, that's super cool. We can't read the card. The printing is so small. So we learned something. Then we redesigned them with all of that feedback in mind. because we wanted them to truly be things, entities, objects that teachers wanted to do. And we did a pilot in South Carolina elementary schools with a kind of ad hoc design, a delayed implementation design. But we saw, some evidence or some signal of promise here that there were improvements in teacher reports of what we call regulation-related skills during the phases of implementing brain games that were very steep compared to what we saw during the phases where they weren't. So we thought, okay, this is not without merit. We could continue with this and then do it in an actual trial, which we've now done in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And then we've been adapting them and translating them and contextualizing them and doing them in education and emergency settings around the world. So they're in Arabic and all kinds of other languages. We don't know what we're going to do next, but I'm going to give you just a sense of what we found with our trial. This was also, we just finished this last year or the year before. This is like a trial that you do when you don't have any money. And so you just do your best. And we had 6 schools in Lawrence. We wanted to do it close by who were willing to participate. They were willing to engage in classroom level randomization, which we did. And the teachers in those classrooms randomized to brain games participated in the training, and they really did the games. And they gave us lots of information about implementation. On average, they did about 3 games per week. These games are games. It's like freeze dance or red light, green light. They're sort of bumped up executive function games that you can do in a classroom. They take about 5 to 10 minutes. You can do them for longer, but they don't take long. So teachers did about 3 games a week, which is kind of close to what we found in that first trial. Teachers did between 3 and 4 games a week. And then we saw impacts in a whole bunch of measures of EF and self-regulation, which is pretty much mostly what we measured in the study, because we wanted to focus quite precisely on those outcomes. Global, what we're calling global EF, using the trail-making task. Attention and impulsivity, using the assessor report, which is basically the person who's running the direct assessment with the kids makes a quick rating of their attention and impulsivity after the assessment. And then on a teacher report of kids' regulation-related skills, which is a short survey, and then a teacher report of their pro-social behavior. So we felt like, okay, yeah, if you do this, you really can expect to see effects in that very specific domains, in those very specific domains. So what if we just made a whole bunch of these for all of the skills in those big domains of SEL? What if we identified these strategies and practices and did the same thing? Like maybe that would make a difference in the landscape of work in SEL. So we did that. We took all those programs that we included in that Wallace guide, and in order to create the Wallace guide, we coded them. So we read every activity in every lesson, in every unit, in every grade, and basically coded 2 things. What specific skill does this strategy target, and what's the instructional method? Is it a role play? Is it a game? Is it some kind of lesson? Is it a structure? Is it a routine? What is it? And we essentially created a database that you can search for specific skills. So what are all the strategies that have been coded as targeting emotion regulation in these data? Out of that question comes about 400 different things from 25 programs for elementary school. If you look at those 400 different things and you pull out the ones that could stand on their own and don't demand a scope and sequence, there are about 200. If you look at those 200 things and code them, thematically you have about 7 to 10 unique strategies, like ways of teaching and supporting emotion regulation in these programs. So really you can distill the programs into a smaller number of things. So we did that, and we've created a catalog of strategies. There are about 100, and we went through a cycle of piloting them with teachers, asking them, like, would you ever do this? Can you do this? Did it work? What do you think about it? Tell us what to change. And from there, we identified between 30 and 35 strategies that we want to actually test. And I'm not going to go through that. one thing I'll just say about this idea of common elements, like if you look at all of those SEL programs and you think like, wow, could it possibly be that they all do the same thing? Like they have a different character to them and some emphasize one thing more than another. But they all have certain things they do. Every single one of those 25 programs has a routine for physiological regulation. Every single one. They all look really different. Like in PATHS, it's this turtle thing. In SECURE, it's something with a penguin. It has a few more steps. In RULER, it's the mood meter. In second step, it's got this calm down strategy. In Mind Up, it has a kind of mindfulness thing. They look really quite different. You might say, wow, those are different ways of supporting kids to learn physiological regulation. They're all the same. Like they all have the same basic steps to them. So there is inside these programs a common set of things that you could pull out and do on their own. I don't think you need a 10-unit program that gets implemented for half an hour, every Tuesday or every day to do physiological regulation in your classroom. It should be just this. And this is the thing we should scale, and this is the thing we should test. So as I said, we generated this catalog. We got to about 30 to 35 strategies, and then we made the kernels. Like we made cards that have on each one a strategy that can be easily done by a teacher. And they have a particular structure that is this rigid structure I talked about before. So here's an example of one of the kernels. It's called a feeling circle. It's rigid structure. Each kernel has 3 elements to it. It has a part that makes the skill really explicit, like what is the thing that you're learning? What learning emotions, vocabulary, like that's the thing that you're learning. What's the activity that you're going to do to practice that thing? And then debrief at the end. What went well? What didn't go well? What was this like for me? Every single kernel has that structure, but everything else about it can be adapted. So you can do a feeling circle with all sorts of different things in it, as long as it adheres to that core structure, and we have a kind of must-do. Everybody in the circle has a chance to do it. So we pulled out of the data about strategies the kinds of things that had to be there, the things that we imagined could be adapted. And they come on a set of cards like this. That's the back. We're in the phase where we're mounting a trial of these strategies. We're doing it in partnership with schools in British Columbia because they're very ready to do it and they're really bought in. And so for this trial, don't only ask me privately about the design because I'm really insecure about it and I'm not sure how to do it. So I won't answer a question about it. I'm just kidding. I will. So we're doing a trial with schools in British Columbia because they're really bought in, and we want to do, at least at this stage, we want to do the best trial we can to see if there's a kind of, can this idea work? Okay, so last thing. I know, it's 4:30. I'll just tell you one more thing. This is the second innovation, which is dealing with this lexicon that I basically started with, which is that this field is populated with so much language. It's really hard for researchers, for certainly practitioners, definitely policymakers, to figure out what's the same and what's different. And this is a particular issue when you're trying to connect, I won't go through this, what we know with what we do. So I'm just going to give you an illustration of this because it makes it very clear. So I showed you this like cycle that guides all of our work, this link between research, between what we know and what we do, how we evaluate things, and how that feeds into the knowledge base. So let's say we were operating with those principles in mind and we wanted to build an intervention that really was focused on self-control, and we wanted to use what we know about self-control to guide us to design an intervention. And we said, wow, there is this amazing paper by Terry Moffat and her colleagues, and it shows how self-control is related to all those life outcomes. That's what we know. I'm going to use that paper to guide me to figure out what to do. So if we looked at that paper and we said, okay, what's self-control? What do we know about it? I just extracted a few pieces of the paper and I put them here. What do we know? The need to delay gratification, control impulses, and modulate emotional expression is the earliest and most ubiquitous demand that societies place on their children. Wow, That's really important. But I've just learned that self-control includes in it things like delay of gratification, controlling impulses, and modulating emotional expression. All right, that sounds good to me. Okay, so in the paper then, how do they specifically define self-control? Like, what do they say about self-control when they define it? They say self-control is an umbrella construct that bridges concepts and measurements from different disciplines. True. Impulsivity, conscientiousness, self-regulation, delay of gratification, inattention, hyperactivity, executive function, willpower, intertemporal choice. Okay? Okay, I'm getting a little overwhelmed as the person who's thinking about what I'm going to do. And then I say, okay, well, how did they measure self-control in this study? Okay, briefly, the 9 measures of childhood self-control in the composite include observational ratings of children's lack of control, parent and teacher reports of impulsive aggression, and parent and teacher and self-reports of hyperactivity, lack of persistence, inattention, and impulsivity. Okay, so I think this is fascinating, and I love this paper. I do trash it this way because I think it's a good example of something that occurs over and over again. If you've read this, what might you do? You might say, based on this research paper, which is quite impactful in the world, people cite it all the time. You might say, okay, in our setting, I'm really thinking about this. This is how we're going to define self-control. Conscientiousness. That really resonates with us. Like, this is a value we really have, and we think this is really important. And here in this paper, they used all these measures, so I'm going to get a measure of hyperactivity. So I'm going to design a strategy around conscientiousness, and then based on this paper, what it says, I'm going to get a measure. I like this hyperactivity one. It's short. Teachers can report it. Seems like it's a good one. Do you think that you will observe effects of that strategy focused on conscientiousness on hyperactivity? I don't know. If you didn't, you wouldn't have any idea why, right? Could be that your strategy was no good, or that maybe you just didn't have a measure, because this terminology is bedeviling efforts to be very precise in this cycle. So we decided to design some kind of system that would allow those out in the field to navigate between the major frameworks that define what's important in this broad landscape of SEL. And we designed it to sort of operate like a Rosetta Stone. So you could make judgments about, like, in framework A, X, Y, and Z are defined and described. In framework B, C, D, and F are defined and described. And some of those use the same words but have different meanings, and some of them use different words but actually mean the same thing. How am I going to see where they line up? So we created this website that we released to the public on Tuesday, which is why I persisted and didn't pay attention to the time, because, you know, how am I going to get people to look at it unless I just tell you about it in the room? You can Google it and get on there right now. It's called Explore SEL. It's a bunch of tools. And basically what we did is gather the major frameworks that characterize the field, and we coded them using the same system that we applied to those programs I described before. And the code allows us to create a set of linkages between the terms. And so the website has a bunch of tools that allow you to see the degree to which different frameworks emphasize different areas of SEL. It allows you to look at frameworks directly against each other and see where different terms share lots of codes or share a few codes, whether or not they have the same name or not. And then it's got this kind of crazy thing that no one on my team really thinks is great, but I love because it's beautiful. So, but it allows you to see across all of the frameworks exactly where specific skills are. And then all throughout it, there's a thesaurus. So you can select any term from any place in the site and get a definition for it based on what that framework, how that framework defines it, and see every other term in the system that was coded or that shares lots of codes with it. So that's Explore SEL. There's another feature to it that if I can get online, I'll just show you, that we're still working on, that is not released to the public. Yeah, I forgot about this part. Okay. Hold on. You can ask me questions while I do this if you want. Let's see if I got that right. Yeah. Okay, so so this is a part of the site that is not yet public because we haven't quite figured out what we think about it. But you can basically mess with the threshold. So the coding system allows you to create a bunch of matrices that show how connected these terms are across the different frameworks. And those matrices essentially sit behind like a big network map. And you can mess with the threshold that defines how closely related two things are. You can say that everything has to be perfectly overlapping or everything is not overlapping at all or somewhere in the middle. And what that does is essentially allows you to see across all those frameworks and all those terms whether or not there are clusters of terms that emerge across all of them. So is there a way, our question is like, is there a way to apply social network analysis or something like that to these matrices in order to see if there's like a more fundamental configuration of this terminology that characterizes the field. And so this is just a version with a threshold of 0.4, but you can move the threshold in one direction or the other. It's not doing it now because I don't know how to use this computer, but you can move that threshold and all the dots begin to move around. So, oh, you're not even seeing it. Nobody told me. Okay. That's why you all look so bored. That's because I'm looking at it, not you. I don't know how to get it up there, but it looks like this. Can you see those dots? You can come up and look at it later. I can't believe no one told me. This is a very well-behaved group. Okay. So never mind on that. It is so cool. You guys missed the whole thing. Okay, so 3 key ideas. Social emotional skills and competencies are multifaceted. They develop in relationships. Approaches that work, that are effective, really are targeted, and they build skills that are in ways that are relevant to the kids and the adults in those settings. And then I think that the way to move this work forward is to build on all of the great stuff that's happened before and really get precisely focused, like the mindset work is, actually, and think about new approaches to intervention. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions and show you the dots if we can figure that part out. Which I'm going to obsess about now, so I won't do that.
Trying to get the dots while you answer it.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Great. Any questions? Comments? Work that you're doing?